jer si milostivi čovekoljubi Bog i tebi slavu uznosimo, Otcu i Sinu i Svetome Duhu, sada i u vekove vekova.
In a world of shadows and secrets untold, where primeval stories make the brave go cold, mighty gods on high and realms below, whispers of legends that shape each soul. And nightmarish dreams, cryptids lurking, nothing's as it seems, giants walking, angels and demons fight, only truth can bring the light. Through the echoes of time the tales unfold, mysteries arise as the prophecies are foretold, from valiant knights to buried treasure, this podcast brings nothing but pleasure. Welcome to Myth, Mysteries and Majesty. Study with us and don't be a travesty. Theology, mythology, fantasy and horror, from dungeons and dragons to Skyrim and Mordor. Phantom powers haunt the evening, in gothic castles where they're screaming. Wizards cast spells in their towers tonight, exploiting enigmas hidden from our sight. Archaeologists make excavations deep of the ancient tombs where pharaohs sleep. In the dust of ages we chronicles keep, storytelling's power of monsters that creep. Myth, mysteries and majesty is the place for you to learn about this haunted space. From scholarship to manuscripts of old, unlock the secrets of wisdom and gold.
Hello and welcome to Myths, Mysteries, and Majesty. I'm Shaun. I am the co-host, and we are taking over the channel because Nico is on vacation. Not at the time of the recording, but at this airs. So, right now we have the special privilege of having our resident scholar, Amber, who is a Hebrew scholar, and she's going to help us to try to understand offerings and how they are different than sacrifices, and maybe some of the misconceptions that we have in the American church regarding how the systems operated, what they actually did, and how those are reflected in Christ and in the New Testament church, and really why that's important for us. So as we go ahead and get into this, I'm going to start with Amber. How you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing good. I'm wrapping up the summer semester, and because I haven't graduated yet, so I'm still working on my master's in biblical studies. And my focus is now on intertextuality, which is how the Old Testament and the New Testament work together, which is even more fun because I was an Old Testament major, but now I've shifted into intertextuality, which is really fun and really complicated and confusing, and nobody quite knows what that is, but it's a lot. We're going to get into a lot of that talking about this, especially when we get to the end and what all this means in the New Testament. But I'm always happy to be here. It's even more fun because I get to do this with you, and you're one of my absolute favorite YouTube beards on online, and I always love when we get to collab together. So I'm just really happy about doing this.
Well, thank you. That's awesome. And I guess you just confirmed that you're the perfect person to do this episode. So I chose well. So maybe if you could start us off by explaining what is an offering? I mean, this is a word that kind of has a lot of baggage to it. And it would be helpful for us to understand, technically, what are we talking about when we're talking about the offerings in the Old Testament system?
Right. So a lot of people, when you say that, they automatically go and think like Leviticus and a whole bunch of complicated stuff and all these dead animals and just all kinds of grossness. But if you go and look at the entirety of Scripture, offerings are something that are given in response to God as a way to participate in relationship with God. So there is a very much a relational aspect to it. Sometimes it's done by individuals, sometimes it's done by families or entire communities or nations. And so it is very much a part of the everyday life in the ancient Near East. And what that really shows us is about bonding. It's about love. It's about self giving and about being in relationship and community with one another and with your deity or with God in our religious context.
So offerings aren't just like
Mhm.
an unending line of animal sacrifice. It's not just baptized butchering, uh, where where you have an altar that is just permanently stained with blood for no other reason than maybe the deity wants to see the ground soaked with blood, or some of these things that the Bible has been accused of, like, is
Mhm.
God a moral monster for advocating for the killing of all these animals? And I think we really have a misconception about what the whole system entails. So maybe you could break down some of the what were some of the motivations for a person giving an offering? Was this something that they felt compelled to do, or was this something that was more arose out of a spirit of thankfulness?
I think there's a couple things that are going on there, Sean. First of all, I think there is a little bit of confusion because sometimes there's things are referred to as offerings and sometimes things are referred to as sacrifices. And sometimes those are overemphasized that they are different things, which all of them are offerings. Sacrifices are a subset of that, which usually requires something to be consumed in some way, usually burned with fire, so that that is turned into an aroma that will pass up and be able to go up into the heavens and be something that that God or the deity involves is able to participate in directly. So, but there are other kinds of like things that are offerings, like the wave offerings or some of the grain offerings. Not everything is burned on an altar. Some of them are given, and a portion is taken out, and then the rest of it is either eaten or consumed by the priests or by the priests and the community. So, and all of the offerings are a way to. So, if you think about it, the first offering that we have record of is in Genesis 4, Cain, the story of Cain and Abel. And that just kind of comes out of nowhere. All of a sudden, here we are, and they're offering, one's offering an animal, one's offering produce of the field. And, it's just kind of like, well, where did this come from? But it is, we see it later in Hebrews, it talks about the state of their heart. So this is something that is giving back to God. So the offering systems in the ancient Near East, especially in like we're talking Old Testament, like Torah before the establishment of like the kingdom of David. So really old system there. A lot of those cultures are using that to as a way to like get the attention of their god, to show their love and affection for their deity, and to try to gain favor of their deity. And what we see in before the Exodus is that's a lot of how those are used. They're used in thankfulness. They're used as a gift, a love offering to God. They're not used really as something that is like a atonement or redemptive. Those are the offerer giving a gift to God, which is really what offerings are. They are reciprocal, participatory rituals. I know people don't like that word now, but that's what they are. They're participatory rituals to be able to sit down and participate in a loving relationship with God. And that's really the function of all of the offerings. And so, and when you jumping ahead into when we see the birth of Israel, what's happening with like the exit, you get the Exodus narrative, they're brought out, and what they do, what God does is set them apart and distinguish them as this is my chosen nation. They are a holy people set aside for a purpose, which is the fulfillment of the covenant of Abraham to bring all people back into relationship with him. But Israel's the vehicle of how we're going to get there, and takes this offering system of the other pagan nations and takes that and also sanctifies, makes holy that to make it something that is separate and all participatory to God, and removes the pagan magic aspect out of it. So you can't do an offering that is going to obligate God, because humans can't obligate God to anything. So that aspect is removed, because that's an impure use of that with Yahweh. So, but what's left is how do we get to participate with God? And in the story, they're at Mount Sinai, they're given the covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and start. So this is the tabernacle, and they start the system of some of the basics of the offerings are laid out in that. But you get to the end of Exodus, and the tabernacle's been built. They're getting ready to go on the road to the promised land. But all of a sudden in chapter 40, there's a problem because Moses can't get into the tabernacle. Moses is, there's a problem. You can't get access to God the way that they're supposed to. And you've got the story, then you've got the book of Numbers, which is the actual two worst road trips in history that go horribly wrong, right? And they talk some more about the sacramental system in there. But the problem is, how do we get to the promised land if we can't get into the tabernacle? So that's where the book of Leviticus comes in, because Leviticus is how we get back into and maintain that participatory relationship with God, so that God is among the people, leading them to the promised land. So it's fixing a problem that's been created by barred access to the tabernacle.
See, I think that's so important for us to understand, especially in the New Testament context of, well, what actually is the problem? I think we assume that we know what the problem is, right? We assume that, okay, well, the problem is moral failure, and if we can just morally be better, then we'll be acceptable before God, and it kind of is not the case. there's so much in the offering system that doesn't have anything to do with morality at all. It just is your portion as being a human. So there was a word that you kept saying in there, and some of the material that you sent me in order to prepare for this. By the way, who can read all of that? I tried so hard. There's no way, not with my little brain. But one of the words that came out is the word for, I think it is the grain offering, is also the word for gift. And that's the word that is used for both Cain and Abel's offering, which is interesting, because you would think, well, Cain or Abel is offering an animal, and doesn't that make it more like a shouldn't we think of it more like a sacrifice? But it's listed there, or it's the word used as gift. And if we think about how gifts work, especially in the ancient world, if you were to give a gift to the king, you could never obligate them to do anything, because you're not on an equal level of them. You can't blackmail a king into doing something for you. And if your intention was to do that, you might end up dead. But in order to have leverage over somebody who's very powerful, you have to be equally powerful. And yet we know, as humans, we are creatures, and our creator is all powerful. So there's no way that we could ever obligate him to do anything. But giving him a gift is a way of trying to endear him to us, that it's not, we're not manipulating him. We are trying to gain access to relationship. And so I think that's important for us to think about. And I think maybe we come up with a lot of problems, at least I do, especially by reading the material that you sent me, was was I didn't realize how much I'm reading New Testament theology, not the text of the New Testament, but New Testament theology that comes from the text back into the Old Testament offerings and sacrifices. And I think that muddies the water and clouds our understanding of what's happening. Because if we have a theology of blood and fire and sacrifice, and we read that back into the Old Testament, that's all we're going to see. But it's like the wave offerings and the grain offerings and the drink offerings and all of these things that are just part of relationship and just part of community. They kind of get pushed to the wayside, and all we're thinking about is, you know, maybe the more metal portions of the Old Testament system, which is like kill it all and burn it. And yet that's not really representative of the Old Testament covenants, is it?
No, it isn't. It's really about, I think, a couple of things. One, we get stuck on the word sacrifice, and in our brains, we think globally throughout history. You know, you've got Aztecs, and there's human sacrifice, and it's requiring the death to appease an angry deity. And that's what sacrifice in most of the rest of the religious context of the world means. So that word sacrifice is very loaded terminology. And we have, because of, and we'll get into this some more later when we get into the New Testament and church modern application of this, but the history of Christian theology as it really got interesting with the Reformation and how all of those different things kind of fractured a lot of things, packed on a certain theological point of view looking at atonement in a way that is not in the Old Testament at all. But when you require for your understanding of atonement, suffering, pain, and death, and an angry God to be appeased, you're definitely going to read that back into the Levitical system. And that's not what those sacrifices were meant to do, because if it starts, you have to think, where do we start? We start with Genesis 1. Why did God create? And you have to go very back to that very first question. Why? In an overabundance of love within the Trinitarian relationship, God wants to share that blessing of his love and his hesed. And so he creates man to be in this love-giving reciprocal relationship. And I use that word extremely intentionally because it's meant to be an exchange of I give to you out of my love and overflow, and you give back to me out of your love and overflow. And it's a pattern that's supposed to go all the way from Genesis 1 into our, like you and I, Shaun's friendship. That is that's a pattern that is mirrored, especially amongst Christians. We are supposed to be reciprocal relationships. So out of my love and gratitude and humility and appreciation for what God has done for me and my relationship with Christ, I share that with you because I share that relationship in mutual relationship with Christ, and I bless you with that. And then there's times where you return that and bless back. And so it's meant to be mutually edifying for the community and to the relationship. So it's horizontal and vertical at the same time. And it goes both directions, sometimes simultaneously, to create like a triangle that might look like a trinity, maybe possibly.
So, you know, the Bible tells us that God causes it to rain on the just and the unjust alike. And when we think about this idea of reciprocal gifts, God is always in the business of giving gifts. And so when we're looking at the offerings and we question, are these people manipulated to give gifts? Are they coerced into it? I think maybe we have suffered from modern or postmodern understanding of the world and how it works, whereas they were very grounded in that understanding that God is actually giving us all these gifts. And so for us to give back, this isn't something that is trying to manipulate God. This is just us showing that we're thankful for what he's given us and to give him the best, because we know that he continues to give to us. And it's almost like the difference between a worldview of abundance and a worldview of scarcity. I think in the
Yep.
modern times, we operate on a worldview of scarcity, whereas maybe they were like, well, God gave this to me anyway. Like, I'm going to give it to him. And
Right. Yep.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was just thinking that just sparked another thought, because I think sometimes there's a lot of certain views of theology that create some sort of environment of a zero sum gain for the love of God. And so it's like, I'm going to try to buy God's favor. I'm going to try to, I'm going to try to beg God's favor. I'm going to try to grovel at this angry God who, hates me, and try to, have to make up for some offense that I've done, because I have to get, because there is a zero sum game of the love of God. But that's not how it works. Like, it is the opposite of, everyone. It's like, imagine, like, if you imagine a table, there's not uh, you're not going to run out of table at God's house. It's like, oh, look, there's three more people, add three more chairs. Like, it's not like a pie. God's love is not like a pie and there's only so many slices. It's like the fish and the bread, the miracle that Jesus did. It just keeps multiplying until everyone is fed. It's not limited to the Hunger Games for, five fish and three loaves or whatever, three fish and five loaves, I think. And I don't, it's New Testament. It's not my, it's not as good as the New Testament, but I probably shouldn't say that out loud. But, it's not like there's a competition for just the three and the five. Jesus takes those three and the five and shows us God's love is not a zero sum game. It is never going to run out. So much is given that they have, 12 huge vessels, massive vessels of baskets left over. Like, there's enough for another, like, 1,000 people to eat, because of the love of God is so abundant. It's not a zero sum game. So we have to remove this idea of the zero sum game kind of math from this, how we think about the sacrifices, because we're not trying to buy our way into it's not the Hunger Games. It's not like the ones who survive get to participate in God's love. It's not how it works. There's no competition, because there's more than enough for everyone.
Yeah, and anyone who is chuckling right now saying, well, how do you not know which one it is? Well, you got to remember, Jesus did this twice. He fed 5,000 and he also fed 4,000. So, okay, I don't even
Right.
know which of the stories. I know that there were 7 baskets and 12 baskets, and I have no idea. I think 2 fish and 5 loaves was one of them, and I have no idea what was in the other one. So, and I read the Bible all the time. So it's like, yeah, it's okay to get this mixed up. And like I said, this is our Old Testament scholar. So if it's not, I guarantee you she knows facts about the Old Testament that you've never heard of before. Um, so now in Western theology, because I talk about these things, and intellectually I think I get them, but emotionally I think I'm still kind of in that camp of blood and fire, because of that's my upbringing. I think in the Western tradition, it was more about preserving the peace of the empire. Christianity kind of became a means to an end, in order to kind of subjugate. Maybe subjugate is the wrong word. I mean, it's for the peace of everyone, so it did benefit everyone. They had good intentions, but they wanted to guilt you into glory, so that you were like, look at the sufferings of Christ and look at what you did to him, and so then abstain from sin, and of course the sins that were the ones that were most advertised as being bad were the ones that offended the fabric of peace that was happening in the Roman Empire. And I think we carry that with us as Western Christians. Do you know? And I know you're not necessarily a scholar of the Eastern religious tradition, but based on your understanding of the Old Testament, and the East kind of being the people who received that Old Testament and the New Testament, um, do they have that same baggage and the same hangup that we had operating under Rome?
I think what I would back you up and say, I think that's not the place to start with where the divergence happened, because in the ancient Near Eastern mind, that's not how anthropology and ontology are very, very different in the ancient mind. So it's going to be very much more what now we would think of as something that's right brained. So it's much more picture based, much more holistic. There's much more of an understanding of this wholeness aspect. And I think where this concept gets polluted and starts diverging is with where I think Augustine starts to make some mistakes and starts to create, instead of the Eastern mind view that as the full image of God, I don't have any bad parts, but sin is going to be, here's the standard, and I miss the mark of that standard. And so I have to just keep improving to do better, to recalibrate my aim, to get closer and closer to actually hitting that mark, to meet that standard, which is what the Day of Atonement does. I mean, that's the whole point of the Day of Atonement, is to recalibrate, to try to meet that standard again for another year. So when you think about sin, isn't that I'm some sort of morally corrupt agent, or that there's not this inherent corruption, that it completely changes the mindset of where those two diverge. And so, it kind of goes back to Augustine kind of started the ball rolling, and then you get Anselm and the Reformation, and that really is the divergent. I think it goes back to your ontology and how do you view people. If you're inherently corrupt and can do nothing right because of this passed on inherited moral corruption from the fall in Genesis 3, then you have to have some sort of punishment based system where God is offended by you because you are corrupt. But if you have a more holistic view of, I miss the mark, I make mistakes, I fail, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally, but the system is meant to cleanse impurity and reestablish the place of relationship with God, which is what the Old Testament does, and the New Testament does the same thing, I would argue, then it's a completely different, divergent way of looking at it. So it really, I think, instead, Shaun, goes back to your ontology and your view of human nature instead of more about political control. I think it really, really goes back to your ontology.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I'm assuming that your understanding of political control would definitely be downstream of your understanding of human nature.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I read that was just so interesting to me, because it is something that I struggled with a lot, is some of the offerings that you gave in the Old Testament. In fact, maybe the majority of the ones that we think of as sacrifices, which are not really sacrifices. And here we'll probably move into that section of what is a sacrifice. But some of the offerings that were given were for unintentional sins. And the word that's translated as unintentional there is really like the word that means like in error. So it's not unintentional in the sense that maybe somebody who's more from a holiness tradition would think of, like, oh, this is a sin that you didn't know that you were committing. That actually isn't indicative of what's going on there. This is a sin that you missed the mark. It was an error, but it maybe wasn't a high-handed sin against God.
Right.
Whereas something like a guilt offering was, no, you intended to do this for the purpose of rebelling against God, or you did this for the purpose of mishandling that which was sacred. And so for me, that just brought so much clarity of, because I would read it and I'm like, oh man, these guys, they just didn't even know that they were sinning. They were just walking around, just sinfully producing sins. And no, that's not really what's happening there. It's more of, what we think of as in the New Testament churches, falling into sin. It's not a sin that you intended to do. It's not like you're shaking your fist against God. And I think that goes back to what is our anthropology. If we think that we're just constantly sinful, then whether we intend it or not, then we are sinning against God, and it's egregious, and he deserves to punish us. But I think that in reading the Old Testament passages, we see the opposite, that although we are sinful And although what we do maybe we should view it as maybe egregious, God's intention is not to punish us. God's intention is to provide us with a way to come back to reconciliation, because what he desires is not our punishment, it's our communion. And so I think that's super helpful and beautiful. And I'm still internalizing some of that and trying to, uh,
Right.
how much
Right.
clean water do you have to add to a cup to get all the muddy water out, right? So
Right.
I can intellectually know and say these things, but in my heart I still struggle with it. And it's it's difficult for me. Um, but if you wanted to comment on either that, or maybe just lead us into what is a sacrifice, technically speaking, because there is a difference between the sacrifice and the offering. And this was the one that I was probably most shocked by, as what is a sacrifice and how old is the tradition of sacrificing, because I thought that the tradition of sacrificing went back only as far as the Mosaic Law, but it turns out I was wrong.
Yeah, so I want to, and I also want to make a distinction, because I personally don't use the word sacrifice anymore when I'm talking about some of these things. It got so much baggage to it, and it gets people off track of to what we're talking about. So I have really backed away from that. So what we've got is the distinction between non-atoning and atoning sacrifices, and it's kind of this idea of, so if you think about it, if I have missed the mark and I have made a mistake, and in the Old Testament, ancient Near East, they had this idea of, I don't know, if of the it's something that the East would has put Western words on, of ancestral sin. So we inherit this tendency to fail and to miss the mark. So we bear the weight of being under that, um, that consequence of the fall of Genesis. But in that process, there is this idea in the ancient Near East and in Old Testament, especially Old Testament, uh, pagan. We have to go back to pagan religions to kind of understand this idea, and then we'll take it to the tabernacle temple, because that helps kind of clarify where the difference and the distinction is. But this idea of making mistakes, or missing the mark, or sinning, in that mind frame there, had this is like a concept of like a almost like a residue that would, like, vibes, or if you're a Doctor Who fan, it'd be like Vashton Arada, or there's this idea of this, like when you walk into a very, like, creepy place, and your skin just kind of gets all, like, your hair stand up on the back of your neck, and you just feel like this is wrong. There's this kind of that vibey kind of feel to something that accumulates. And that's what a lot of these, what we would call sacrifices, would, especially the Day of Atonement, it's the cleansing of space. And you have to go back and talk about, really quickly, the idea of sacred space, because that's what we're talking about here. Our relationship with God is in a sacred space. And it's, for now, and for Christians, that's something that is done communally and as a part of the community within ourselves. But in this Old Testament context, that would be in the promised land, that would be on the temple grounds, that would be in the tabernacle camp. There was levels of this sacredness, but everywhere they went, it was established, the sacred space, so that Yahweh could be down amongst the people. So, and that's what the Day of Atonement, with the annual reset, would go through, and it would cleanse all that residue of the weight of the guilt, of the consequences of the sin. I don't want to say guilt, because it also gets us off track from what we're talking about here. So the weight of the consequences of the fallout of intentional or unintentional sin, and that had to be cleansed and reset for another year, so that God could come back in and stay in residence with the tabernacle, on this mercy seat, or in the temple. And it was an annual reset and an annual cleansing of, so it's like, every spring cleaning, we go through and we clean out all of the winter and the, years accumulation of dust and dirt and dust bunnies and grime, and give it a good, you know Clorox bleaching and get everything all nice and clean for another year. That's the same idea. It's cleansing out all of that vibey Vashtanarada weirdness that's accumulated from the weight of missing the mark, and it resets it. And that's what it does. And so, but to do that, that requires a couple of things. Because there's blood involved. That's part of cleansing, and there's water. And both of those are images of life. And so those are taken and put, like the blood is splashed on the altar, and that is one of the rituals that brings about this cleansing, because it's spreading life. And that's what, the hyssop and because it's especially in the Holy of Holies, they can't touch the ark, they would die. And so they take the hyssop, and they, just like they did on Passover, and they took the hyssop and spread the blood on the doorway, creating a barrier, preventing the death from coming in, and keeping, so it was allowing the good in and keeping the bad out, is what it was doing there, so that death would go right on by, because God was standing guard, covering them so it would pass over. And those two things there, they requires something to be broken down. So some of them are not even animal sacrifices, because there were allowances for the poor to bring grain or cakes or bread or things that were baked. So something had to be burned. It was really in the burning. And there's something about the burning that's transformational, that takes it from one state to be able to go up into and participate, so God could participate in that. So there's something that transitional in the burning that gives us access. So there was grain that had to be, milled. It had to be harvested and ground up into wheat and baked. So there's breaking down in that process. And it was the same thing with the animal. Its life had to be taken, and the life was taken by the offerer. And then the priests would do the butchering. They would take the parts, depending on the offering, take the parts that were needed, put it on the altar, and then either they would get to eat what was left, or it was passed out to them and the family. So it would be a community participatory thing. So all of these offerings ended up in some sort of meal that God participated in, because they all included food. So they're all about establishing and getting back into community and into relationship with God. And so the atoning ones also, that's another problematic word I want to be careful with, because we're not saying that that's, requiring suffering and death, because if the animal suffered, it would bruise the meat and make it an unworthy animal to be sacrificed. And so therefore it wasn't, there was very specific ways that animals had to be slaughtered. There was very specific ways. So that's why there's all those really detailed instructions, because it had to be done with great care, so that it was the way to be able to reconcile back into the cleansing the space to the relationship with God by the community and by the individual or the family that was bringing the offering.
I had never thought of this before until as you were talking about the bruising of the meat, and you can't bring anything unclean or impure. In fact, in what the material that you sent me, one of the things that they said was the idea of us thinking about the scapegoat being offered was repugnant to the Israelites, because nothing that had sin laid on it was was fitting to be offered on the altar, because
Right.
that would then stain the altar. And so I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking, okay, so if we think about, and again, I'm jumping way ahead,
Okay.
to the New Testament, but it was just something that sparked in my mind. If we look at the New Testament and we look at Jesus and how he was flogged and beaten and scourged, and he's all tore up, and they put him on a cross, and yet he still has the presence of mind to be able to communicate with people. He's got those 7 sayings from the cross, and then the gospel writers say that he gave up his spirit and died. He was in control of it. I wonder if the purpose of this, just occurring to me, was to signify that although externally Jesus appeared to be bearing all of the weight of sin, the marks on his flesh being signifiers of the sin, that it didn't penetrate to the interior part, that the he was still fully healthy and still fully whole on the cross. He was in that shalom, that wholeness and wellness, because it didn't penetrate to his interior being. So he was still of the quality to be offered up to God. What do you think about that?
I think I would probably disagree with you on that one because don't. I think that that's still looking at it through a formal penal substitutionary point of view. I think that you have to go back and you have to understand, first of all, Day of Atonement and what's going on, because there's two goats. And the first goat is the one that dies, and that cleanses the space to reset the relationship. So Jesus' death cleanses the space to reestablish where we can meet with God. That's what the death does, is it cleanses the space. And then the second goat, which isn't killed, it's, there's the laying on of hands, which is not the transference of sin. So the goat didn't become sin. That's not how that works. You have to think about that more as like the laying on of hands in the Old Testament is like ownership. This is the ownership of this. So think about this more like the weight of the consequence of all that contaminated, vibey, Vashtanarada-y stuff that's accumulated over the year. The weight of that is put onto that goat, and the weight of the consequences of all of that messing up is sent back to Azazel. It's sent back to the originator of the sin problem in the first place. So it's sent back to the wilderness. It's sent back to the demonic forces, the evil powers. And I think that is awaiting the final day of the Lord and the final day of judgment, when all of that sorting of the sheep and the goats and it talks about in Revelation where the devil and his angels will be thrown into the fiery and held account finally and ultimately for the introduction of sin into the world in the first place, that they are going to be held to account for the weight of all of that in that process of atonement. So I think that's more of what's going on there. And I saw something earlier today, and I can't pull it up because it's too new in my head, that was talking about this idea of Isaiah 53 and the suffering servant and what's going on there. But I can't pull it up the top of my head at the moment, but there's a whole different idea that is going on with the suffering that's happening there, but it's about more of a path than it has to do with the suffering itself. So, okay, I think this is what it was. It was talking about how that suffering produces this, the product of suffering is this something that can be offered to God as well. So, like you and I go through a season of a tough suffering, we've been suffering. And what comes out of that when it's done wrestled through with God, the product of that suffering is, humility or gratitude or kindness or, an increased love and relationship and depth and, deepening with God. That is the product of that suffering and the product of why the Messiah suffers, like, because that is the offering that is offered up. The result of that suffering and the product of that is the thing that's offered, not the suffering itself, I think. And so I just read it like this morning or yesterday. So it's still like rumbling around trying to have a landing point that I'm not completely settled on, but I really, I think to me that kind of really resonated with resolving some of the confusion and tension of what's going on with Isaiah 53 and putting penal substitutionary requirement of suffering that has to be inflicted. I don't. I think for me that's a better path to understanding what's actually going on there.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate some of the helpful pushback, and as you can tell, I'm still thinking about these things and still wrestling with them, and so I have shadows and pictures in my mind that I think come together, and maybe they do, maybe they don't, or maybe there's some intermediary things that are fundamental to my understanding that I'm missing there for the pieces to all cohesively come together. And I'm perfectly fine with admitting that, because this is how we think, right? We learn, and then the pieces all click together. So you think you see something in one moment, and then you learn something in it, and the whole puzzle shifts. And so I'm content with our audience just kind of seeing, hey, this is where Shaun's at with his thinking, and he's going to be changing some way. But thank you, that's really helpful. So as far as an actual, like, what the Bible calls the peace offering, which is that's the technical word when the sacrifice comes in. I didn't realize that was like the only time in the offering system where the offerer got to eat the food that was coming off the altar. And they were the ones who were responsible for, like you said, the killing, and even in some circumstances the butchering, because that's when they're told not to eat the blood that's in the meat, because this was the only time that they had the opportunity to mess that up. And so when we think about like this, the word sacrifice, and of course we apply it broadly to everything, which is not technically true, but when we think about sacrifice, it kind of focuses in on this resolution that this is a communion meal between the offerer and God.
Right.
That the elements that of it, like the fat and the desirable organs, those are the ones that are offered up on the altar, and then the other stuff is what they would then eat. And I believe it had to be eaten in a certain period of time, because there had to be an understanding, like this is a meal that's happening in time. It's not something that, okay, well, we're just going to go and put this on a shelf or can it or whatever. Like, they actually had to eat this at relatively the same time they were sending it up to God. And so that's maybe one point. And the second point that I was thinking about is the putting of the stuff on the altar. They really did think about that as this is like them FedExing it to God. It wasn't just like for the purpose of destroying it. It was really, this is how I send it to God. So if you wanted to comment on some of that and just let us know what you're thinking.
Well, I think that, like, going back to like the peace offering, this is one of my favorites, because the peace offering, it is a thank you offering back, to God, and it is it's one of its functions. It can be what's called a votive offering, which is fulfilling a vow. So if you make a vow and you fulfill it, then you go and you make a peace offering to say, this is settled. So I'm being released from my vow because it's been fulfilled. And it's also a free will offering. And for priests, it can be an ordination offering. So it had multiple functions there. But one of the things I love about this is because, one, all of the fat, the kidneys and those what's called the liver, which is called the fatty portions, so when you realize, and this blew me away when I realized this, when you realize that in the ancient Near East mind, in the Hebrew mind of this period of time, that is the center of your person. Those organs, that's where they believed the center of your personness, your essence of who you are, lived there. The brain was extra. So if you look at this is one of my favorites. So like in Egypt, in the embalming process, those were the organs that were preserved, and the brain was thrown out as extra, right? So, so what they're offering there in this process is they're offering the essence of themselves, and everything that's left over that doesn't define the essence of my being and my person, that's what's shared. What's left over from what I give to God is what I share with everybody else in the community. And that had to be eaten right away, and anything that was left was burned, but that was to their shame, because if you didn't bring in enough people, shame on you, you were not inclusive enough of the community. So this was a way of participating in the community and bringing the community together. So it was really, really interesting that, like, if you have anything left, it's not like, oh, we'll just save some of it. It's the same idea of the Passover. The Passover itself in the Exodus event, it was like, eat it all, don't keep anything left over, burn what, only eat what you make, what you can consume. And if you happen to accidentally have some left over, burn it, because you're not staying, you're going. And we're not going to waste it. We're not going to let this thing that is initiated with participation, meal with God, get moldy or any of those others. That's just not, God's like, we're not down with that. So you got to get as many people as you need to eat whatever is here, and do it together as a community with God, because it's all about this participatory reciprocal relationship with God and with each other. So I just like, that's one of the best examples and places to see that, where you're offering the essence of yourself, and whatever's left of that is shared amongst. So the best of you goes vertical, and everything else is done in the horizontal with everyone together. So it really is a beautiful, picture.
So it's interesting because at the offering of a sacrifice, the person would lay their hand on the animal, and
Mm-hmm.
of course, I was always taught this was transferring your sins to the animal, which is absolutely not true. But it was about identifying with the animal, and so
Mm-hmm.
it really is a picture of all of the best of you goes to God, and then the rest of you is just for the sustaining of your life.
Mm-hmm.
But and then, like you said, if you had a small family, and you're not going to be able to eat that all, you bring people in to eat it. It reminds me of the gathering of the manna, right? Those who gathered much,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't have any left over, and those who gathered little, they had enough. And so it's this idea of like bringing in people around your table, because even though you're the one who's bringing this to God, it's almost like he's the host. um,
Mm-hmm.
and so when you're eating it, if you had any left over and it were to become like spoiled, it would be like it would be like you were condemning, or not condemning, but charging God with feeding you bad food.
Mm-hmm.
Which is like, that's totally like crazy to me that this was the idea, and it was communal, and it got the people involved, and that was the point in which they were directly involved with offering stuff to God. That, to me, that's beautiful, because I always thought of the Old Testament temple system as being super like clerical in the way that it operated, in which like the people didn't have any involvement. They were kind of just there, and the priests were the ones who were doing everything. But this is one part, and maybe the most important part, and definitely the oldest part. I mean, this goes back to the individual altars,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is something
Yep.
that the temple system actually brought in from outside. So this goes back to the times of individuals offering things to God. So maybe the most important of the offerings was something that got the whole community involved. Would you say that that's accurate?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and because the whole heart of the Hesed love of God that is built into, and the whole point of redemptive care of Torah is care of the poor and the widow and the foreigner. And this is one way built into the system where that is required of you. And so you have more than you need. Go grab some people that are on the street who can't provide for themselves, and care for. This is one more way to care for the poor and the widow and the orphan, because you can bring them to your table for the excess of this offering that's brought. So it is always God bringing the full community together, not just those who can afford it. That's why there's a scale system. If you can afford it, bring a bull. If you can't, bring a pigeon. If you can't, bring bread. Like, there's a scale there, because God's not saying you have to, afford to be able to buy my affection. This isn't for the rich. God's not tossing out everyone who can't afford to pay the tax at the door. This is, I want the whole community together. So if you have more, bring in the who have less, and then share what you have and balance it out for caring for everyone. And it's just, I love how God builds this care and this preservation of life into the system. That is something I think that, again, our misunderstanding of sin and a misunderstanding of sacrifice and a misunderstanding of atonement strips that beauty out, because it's more about torture and punishment and guilt and appeasing an angry God than it is participating in lovingly restoring everyone equally together back to God.
That's awesome. Okay, so when we're thinking about these sacrifices, one of the ones that to me is kind of confusing, but maybe should be the most apparent, is the whole burnt offering. So we know that with the sin offering, you had the animal and the priests got to eat it, and they went and they would offer the blood. With the guilt offering, it was kind of similar. With the sacrifice, the people got to eat it, but the whole burnt offering, it's like the whole thing's going up on the chopping block. So what's happening with that? How are we supposed to think about that?
I think really what's going on there is that this is the whole thing goes, it's broken down, and the whole thing goes on the altar because it is completely meant to be pleasing to God. So it could be like done as, again, another votive or the completion of a vow. You would dump the whole thing. It could be a free will offering. It could be part of prayer and supplication. It could be part of a daily, weekly, or monthly or festival pattern that was happening. You see that in Numbers 28 and 29. And it could be to used either by itself or in combination with a grain offering for the sin or atoning offerings that could be there. But that whole thing is given to God because that is the pure response of love back to God in the overabundance of our love and gratitude and wanting to be brought back into community relationship with restored into, redeemed into God's Hesed participant relationship. The whole thing is sent to God. So that is 100% vertical because that is focusing all of our affection on God because that's where it's supposed to be. And out of that, the other offerings not only focus us on God, but also on community. But that one's 100% vertical because that's where if our eyes aren't 100% on, and you see this with Israel, when their hearts and their eyes aren't 100% on God, the wheels come off and everything goes bad. Like that's where, and now in our context here, we have to laser focus on Christ because that's what these burnt offerings were doing. It was laser focusing on God because the whole thing went. It wasn't, we weren't distracted in community and making sure it was distributed and the right parts were given to whomever. The whole thing went because we were laser focused on God.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of what Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, right? So you take the best part of your flock and that was offered to God so that way you didn't idolize your possessions. And also, I have this really awesome thing that you gave me. Here, you have it. Which is, I mean, but isn't that kind of human nature? I mean, obviously, as we get older, we become greedy. But I mean, you've got kids. When the kids were little, they would find something that they loved and they would hand it to you. Like, this is the coolest thing. Here, you have it. And it's almost like giving it to God for safekeeping. Like, this is the best thing. Here, you have it. I love that, and I can almost see like the innocence in it of I don't, this is too good for me. I don't want to have this. I don't want to ruin this, so I'll give it to you. Is that kind of what's going on there?
I think it's more like, like when I love watching really young kids, like toddlers and young preschool kids, because they'll pick up and they'll bring you like hand you like my daughter used to collect what she called treasures. And so she would bring me like, here's this rock that I found, and this is amazing. So I want to give it to you. And I'm just like, it's a thinking to myself, it's a rock. But the fact that she loved me enough to give me something that she felt was a treasure of hers, that's what's going on. Like this is something of value to me, but I am giving it to God because I love God so much that I'm just going to go, here, God, I love you so much. I'm going to give you this thing of value without any thought to anything else except purely out of that just pure joy of the love of the relationship. I'm going to send this up to you.
So, one of the things that kind of challenges our maybe popular ideas of what's going on in the sacrificial system is grain offerings and drink offerings. Like nothing has to die there. What's going on with this? Why is this going up on the altar? Is it that we're trying to make sure God gets his carbs in? I mean, I'm curious how this works.
Yeah, I think that this has to go back to the burning rite, where the burning is transforming, where it's etherealized so that it can ascend. Because you have to remember, in the ancient Near East mind, so you've got the way that their worldview works is there's no distinction between the spiritual and the everyday life like we have now. It's all the same thing. Everything is religious. Their existence is their religion and is their interaction with the spiritual world and with with their deities and evil, and it's all very, very real. And in their view, you have the divine realm up above, and then you have the temporal carnal realm of people, and then you have this impenetrable sky plate in between. So, and you see this in Genesis 1, you see this where God separates the heaven, the sky from, so you see that idea is echoed there as well. But that humans can't go up through the sky plate to where the deity lives in the divine realm. That just, you can't pass there. So if I have a gift for my deity, how do I get it there? Well, the way that that gets done is you burn it. That transforms it, it sublimates it, it etherealizes it, so that smoke, that incense, that smoke is the thing that can penetrate through that sky plate up into the divine realm to get it to that deity. So that's how I take this symbol of this meat, this grain, this, the all those offerings of the oil and the, like, not all of them required burning, but everything that required burning, that's how it got in their minds. That's how it actually got up to God, was because it had to become smoke so that it could penetrate that sky plate and get through that sky plate into the divine, because humans can't go up there. A deity could come down here, but we can't ascend past that sky plate to the realm of the divine. That's just impossible for humans. So somehow we have to get our gifts there. And that's done by burning, turning it into smoke, which would penetrate that sky plate and go up into that deity. So then God could inhale that. And because God doesn't have to eat, God, what does God need food for? God doesn't need to eat. But that's why it talks so much about this pleasing aroma. To God, it was a pleasing aroma because he's eating, he's participating in that meal with us, because that smoke is going up into the divine realm where God lives, and he is participating that way.
Now, the last one of the offerings that to me is really interesting because it doesn't participate in the burning is the wave offering, or like the heave offering. And so I'm thinking of like Captain Jack Sparrow saying, "I've got a jar of dirt." Is that how we're supposed to be thinking of this wave offering? That they're just kind of like, "Hey, look what I got." How does this work?
Oh, that's, yeah, that's a funny one. So you get with that one, it's just kind of like this, because that wave offering was like, okay, God, here's this thing that I'm offering, but then it was consumed by the priests and the family. So it was something like, okay, God, I'm symbolically giving this to you, but then God takes the priests take God's portion, and that's used to feed the priests, and then the family eats the rest of it. So that's used as sustaining life, because God cares about sustaining life, and that's built into the sacrificial system as well. So if I'm really poor and all I have is something that, all the grain that I have, and I take it and I can't burn it, because what am I gonna eat? But I can take it and, do the wave offering thing and say, look, God, here is this. Thank you for this. And then I get to eat it to sustain myself, so that it keeps me alive. So that I think that's the preservation of life that's built into that system.
So it was a way of first formally or symbolically offering
Mhm.
it up to God and saying, "Hey, this is yours,"
Right.
and then I'm going to eat it because I'm also yours, and I'm got to maintain myself.
Right, it's God giving it back. God's like, you're like, "I give you this in love," and then God says lovingly, "Have it back, because you need to live as well." So it's this, back to this, you can't get away from this idea of reciprocal. It's just, offering this to God in love, and God in love says, "Okay, thank you. Now you can have it back to sustain your life and preserve your life with."